In the middle of a luxurious restaurant in Manhattan, she remained silent while everyone around her laughed. His laughter echoed louder than the toasting glasses. In front of friends in ties, he knelt down theatrically, took a small velvet box from his pocket and asked, "Will you marry me?" The entire room held its laughter for a second. She stared at him. They expected her to be humiliated, blush, or burst into tears, but she just took a deep breath, looked him in the eye, and answered with a firmness that cut through the air, "I am not a betting trophy." People choked in their surprise. He, still on his knees, froze. The laughter died in his throat. An awkward silence filled the room, and before he could say anything, she turned and walked away unhurriedly without looking back. For the first time, he was not the one deciding the end of the scene. What no one there knew, not even the millionaire himself, was that she already knew about the bet. She had known from the beginning. She knew that he had chosen her only because he thought she was unworthy of stepping into the same places as him. She heard the plan, memorized the words, and entered the game on purpose. But what he also didn't know was that this poor girl, who worked as a waitress, was the heir to an even bigger secret. The man he was humiliating was the son of the woman who saved his father's life in the war and who had died for it. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted him to see it, to notice it, to feel it. But when he saw her say no with such dignity in front of all his fellow millionaires, something inside him cracked inside, and she knew that right there, at that very moment, the game was starting, and she wouldn't have to move a single piece. And if you also believe that dignity cannot be bought, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel, because this story is just beginning, and what comes next will turn you inside out. It was the kind of party where everything seemed to sparkle. Soft music filled the spaces between the elegant conversations, the controlled laughter, and the toasts in fine bowls. Everything there smelled of wealth. The crystal chandeliers reflected on the mirrored walls, and the carpet was so thick that footsteps made no sound. An exclusive event at the top of a building in Manhattan where only those with a last name in a magazine or a bank balance in the six figures were allowed in. He, of course, was the center of attention. Ethan Bennett, a young, arrogant millionaire who owned a chain of companies that made more in a month than entire cities did in a year. The women laughed at everything he said. The men treated him like a king. He was the kind of man who hadn't heard no in years, and when he did, he bought a yes on top of it. But that night, while everyone around him was dazzled by their own reflection, someone entered the room and didn't shine like the others. Her. No jewelry, no designer dress, no salon makeup. Just a steady gaze and a silent presence that, strangely, was disturbing. The young woman walked among the guests as if she didn't belong there, but not with shame, but with a kind of calmness that was irritating, as if she knew something that the others didn't. Ethan noticed. For the first time in a long time, something caught his attention without trying. He watched. She discreetly served canapés, but she didn't lower her eyes. His colleagues laughed. "She's staring at you, Ethan," one said, nudging the other. "Maybe you've never seen a millionaire up close." Ethan smiled disdainfully, but there was something about that girl that he couldn't decipher, and like all spoiled men, he mistook mystery for challenge. Behind the scenes, she remained firm, delivering trays, dodging comments, pretending not to hear. But she heard everything. And when she saw the group gathered near the bar, whispering between sips of expensive whiskey, she knew they were up to something. Ethan had bet his friends that he could make that poor girl fall in love and marry him in less than a month. They laughed, toasted, and chose the winning restaurant. She listened, every word, every laugh, and when she turned to look at him for the last time that night, she didn't feel hate. She felt pity, because he had no idea what he was about to lose. She was born in a forgotten corner of a city that no one mentioned on tourist maps. It was a street without sidewalks, where mud mixed with dreams, and the wind beat on the broken windows as if demanding explanations. Her name was Ivy, and her childhood was without flowers, only thorns. Her mother died when she was 7, from cancer that could not be treated due to lack of money. Her father, consumed by grief and drinking, sank into debt and silence. Ivy grew up among cardboard boxes and empty plates, learning from an early age that no one would come to save her. School was the only place where she could breathe. There, books became her only friends. She read hidden under the stairs, while the others played ball or talked about parties. She dreamed of places she had never seen, of smells she had never smelled, and of people who did not make fun of the clothes she had worn several weeks ago. At 13, she began cleaning houses. First it was her neighbors, then the teachers she felt sorry for. At 15, she was serving coffee in a trailer on the road. And at 17, she was already supporting what was left of her family on her own, a silent father and a sick grandmother. But not all of her pain was visible. For years he had been told that he wasn't enough, that she wasn't pretty or smart or worthy of something great. Words hurt more than cuts on her fingers or calluses on her feet, and she kept it all to herself. He swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and moved on. She never answered, but every time she cleaned someone else's bathroom, she promised herself that one day she would leave there, not to rub her success in anyone's face, but to prove to herself that she wasn't what they said. When her grandmother died, Ivy was left alone. The inheritance was a box of old letters, a Bible with markings, and a single phrase that the old woman always repeated. The world tries to break the good, but they bend and come back stronger. Ivy kept fighting. She studied scholarships, worked late nights, cleaned offices downtown, and learned to walk with her head held high. It was during one of those late-night shifts, serving cocktails at luxury events, that she began to observe the other side. Rich people laughing loudly, pretending to have problems they didn't have, disdaining real life as if it were fiction. But she never envied. She just observed. And when she saw Ethan Bennett for the first time, she knew exactly who he was. She knew it by the tone of his voice, the arrogant look, the loud jokes. But she also knew something else, because she recognized that last name, and with it, a story that came from her own grandmother, a story of blood, of sacrifice, of something that had been forgotten and buried, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to unearth it. It was a sultry Friday night on top of a mirrored building that cut through the Manhattan sky that the game began. The room was packed with people who dressed to be noticed, but acted as if they didn't care. Ethan was surrounded by friends, all with glasses in their hands and fake smiles on their faces. It was the birthday of one of the group's investors, and Ivy was discreetly serving the guests, wearing the same black uniform as always, and with soft steps that seemed to make no noise at all. No one noticed the waitress. No one, except Ethan. He had noticed her at other parties. She was different from the others. She had a look that was uncomfortable, as if it could pierce through any social armor. It was the kind of look he didn't know how to deal with. And that night, carried away by arrogance and the pressure of always being the boldest in the room, Ethan decided it would be fun to play with it. One of his friends commented in a mocking tone that she had the face of someone who fell in love easily. Another added, laughing, that she would definitely accept a marriage proposal if it came from someone like Ethan. And then, between sips of whiskey, someone suggested a bet. Ethan should pretend to fall in love with her. This would go all the way. Convince her to go out with him, make false promises, invent a story, create a public moment and ask for her hand in marriage. If she said yes, he would win $10,000 from each of the gifts. But if he lost, he would have to pay for a luxury weekend for everyone in Aspen. They laughed out loud. It was absurd, cruel. But within that circle of vanity, nothing seemed so serious. Ethan smiled. He knew he could be charming when he wanted to. He knew how to manipulate words, looks, gestures, and above all, he believed that all poor people were in need of attention, of affection, of a chance to feel chosen. He looked at Ivy across the room. She was collecting empty glasses, focused, distant, professional. He approached with a measured step, and his friends stepped back to watch. The game had begun. He made conversation with forced charm, asked questions about her, complimented her smile. Ivy responded politely, but didn't smile. Ethan feigned interest in her story. He said she seemed different from the other people he knew, and Ivy just nodded, keeping her breathing steady. Inside, she already knew. He had heard everything from across the counter moments before. Every detail, every laugh. I knew the bet, the amounts, what he really thought. But she decided to stay, not for revenge, but for something bigger. She wanted him to see with his own eyes that dignity cannot be bought, and most importantly, that not every woman accepts being a pawn in a dirty game. The board was set, but she already knew that the one who would dictate checkmate would not be him. The first direct contact happened on a Tuesday morning, far from the lights and noise of the parties. Ivy had been scheduled to serve at a corporate brunch at the headquarters of one of Ethan's companies, a glass skyscraper that seemed to float above the city. The event brought together CEOs, investors, and members of the top management. She arrived early, wearing an impeccable uniform and her hair tied up with precision. She knew that this environment was even colder than the nightclubs, where the shine disguised the cruelty. Here the coldness was declared. As she organized the glasses and napkins, she heard determined footsteps approaching. It was him. Unlike the night of the bet, he was now wearing a light grey suit without a tie, and his hair was purposefully messy. Ethan smiled when he saw her, as if he had found a forgotten toy. "You again," he said, in the casual tone of someone who thinks everyone is always at her disposal. Ivy continued folding the napkins without stopping her movement. "I work in more than one place," she replied neutrally. He took a step closer, leaning in slightly to look her in the eye. "That explains the tired look in your eyes. But I think you could smile more, you know." The sentence came out lightly, like a silly provocation, but Ivy felt the weight of the condescension. She looked up calmly and said, "Smile for what, exactly?" Ethan hesitated for a second. He wasn't used to answers like that. Usually his comments would draw laughter, lowered glances, or nervousness. But Ivy stood firm. He laughed, pretending to find it funny. "You really are different, and I like that." She didn't answer. She just walked away to get the fruit tray. When she came back, he was still there. "Have you had coffee today?" she asked, trying to sound polite. "Yes. With the money I earned working last night," she replied. The silence between them stretched, an uncomfortable, awkward silence that he didn't know how to break. But Ethan didn't give up. Over the next few days, he showed up unexpectedly at other events, asked her to be included in specific parties, offered rides that she declined. He began sending her anonymous flowers, short notes, compliments that seemed sincere. Ivy knew she was part of the game, but she wasn't playing to win. She was playing to show off, to mirror back to him the image of himself he'd never seen. As their encounters became more frequent, Ethan began to feel confused. There was something about her quiet firmness that disarmed him. It was nice to be ignored by someone everyone wanted to impress. He didn't know he was being seen in full, for the first time, and he had no idea that the most humiliating moment of his life was being carefully woven, not out of malice but out of truth. The restaurant they had chosen was one of the most exclusive in New York. Tables were booked months in advance, and the waiters knew the names of the customers before they even showed up. Ethan had bought the entire night of the place just for himself and his friends. It was the night of the bet. Everything was meticulously planned. Softer lights, selected background music, champagne being handed out like water. He wore an impeccable dark suit, the same smile as always on his face, and an almost offensive confidence in his chest. His friends were excited, each with their cell phones ready to film the moment when Ivy, the simple and naive girl, would fall to her knees in emotional tears at the proposal of the man who would supposedly change her life. She entered the place with firm steps. She was wearing a simple dress, a dark blue, that contrasted with the gold decoration around her. Her hair tied in a light bun, her eyes serious, attentive. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She had been invited to a private dinner as a thank you for the services rendered during the company's events. She said she would only agree to go if she wasn't on business. Ethan agreed enthusiastically. He thought she was finally giving in. He thought the trap was closing in on her. Little did he know that he was the one at the center of the siege. Dinner went by with forced conversation, excessive compliments, and glances exchanged between the conspirators. Ivy barely touched her food, not because she was nervous, but because everything about it made her nauseous. When the plates were cleared and dessert was served, Ethan stood up. The soft sound of the piano faded. He walked over to Ivy with a ring in his hand. The jewel sparkled in the light as if it were magic. He got down on one knee theatrically and declared in a projected voice, "Ivy, would you marry me?" The entire room held its breath. The friends' cameras were trained, recording every detail. They expected laughter, surprise, maybe a cry, but Ivy remained motionless. The silence lasted for seconds that seemed eternal. Then she stood up slowly, looked him in the eye, and said, without raising her voice, "I'm not a betting trophy." The words cut like glass. One of the friends choked on his own laughter. Another lowered his cell phone. Ethan remained kneeling, unresponsive. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. Ivy turned her back and walked between the tables, leaving behind a trail of dignity that no one there expected to witness. There were no screams, no tears, no scandal. There was just a woman saying no, and the man who thought he controlled everything now didn't know how to get up from the floor. The next morning, the city went on as if nothing had happened, but within Ethan's circle the silence was deafening. The videos from the previous night had circulated discreetly among the elite groups, without leaking to the public, but with enough force to shake his image. He didn't show up at the company. He cancelled meetings, refused calls, turned off notifications. For the first time, he didn't know how to react to a defeat, and it wasn't just because of wounded pride. There was something deeper, uncomfortable, a feeling that perhaps he had never been in control of the situation. That afternoon, when he arrived at the headquarters building to collect documents, he found a plain envelope on the table in his office. No sender, no note, just his name, written in firm handwriting. He opened it slowly, already feeling his stomach tighten. Inside, there was a single printed sheet with the exact transcription of the dialogue from the night of the bet. Every word, every laugh, every dirty comment, everything he and his friends had said before deciding to use her as a pawn in a game. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten sentence. "I heard, from the beginning, and I stayed so you could hear it too." There was no signature, but Ethan knew. It was Ivy. The blood rushed to his face. His heart raced. He reread the text 3 times, as if he couldn't believe what was in front of him. She knew. She had always known. Every step he thought was a conquest was just the continuation of a choreography she had already mastered. She hadn't been deceived, nor seduced, nor naive. She had watched everything with open eyes and had chosen the right moment to turn the tables. The sense of control he had cultivated so zealously now seemed ridiculous. She hadn't just refused his request, she had exposed him to himself. She had shown him who he was, without shouting, without taking revenge, without equalizing. And worst of all, she had done it calmly, with such a steady elegance that it turned his humiliation into a mirror he didn't want to look at. Ethan spent the rest of the day in silence. His friends tried to joke, to make fun of the situation, to lighten the mood, but he didn't laugh. For the first time, he felt truly ashamed, not of the rejection, but of the man he saw reflected in the words on that paper. Later, when he got home, he found another surprise. The flower he had sent her weeks before, still intact, inside a book, left anonymously. At the door. The title was The Invisible Dignity, and on the bookmark another note. Some people think they control other people's lives, until life decides to teach them in silence. It was a lesson. And he, the late student. 3 days had passed since dinner. Ethan hadn't seen her at any other event, hadn't found any trace of her on any social media, and even though he had discreetly tried to get information from his teammates, no one knew her last name, her address, or even which catering company she worked for. This worried him. Accustomed to being able to locate anyone with a click, Ethan found himself powerless in the face of the silence Ivy had left behind. But what had started as a piqued curiosity quickly turned into an obsession. He searched through event roster files, looked for indirect payrolls, and finally found something. an old list of freelance employees from one of the private events she had worked at. Among them was Ivy Holloway. With that in hand, he hired a personal investigator, not out of revenge, but because something inside him needed to understand what was behind those eyes. What he discovered shocked him. Ivy wasn't just a poor young woman who had fallen on hard times. She was Caroline Holloway's granddaughter, a name that almost no one remembered. But Ethan remembered it. He had heard that name as a child. He remembered a dusty box in the attic of his family's mansion. He remembered hidden letters. The story that emerged went deeper than he had imagined. Decades earlier, during the war, Ethan's grandfather had served as a volunteer medic in the field. In a violent ambush, he would have died if not for a nurse who dragged him miles under fire. That woman was Caroline. She had saved him, and died days later from lack of care when she was left behind. In the Bennett family records, her name had been mentioned only once, in a letter written by her grandfather, thanking her and promising to care for her family if they ever needed it. That promise had been forgotten, and now unwittingly Ethan had humiliated the very granddaughter of the woman who had saved his family's fortune. He went down to the basement of the house where he grew up and searched for hours. He found the letter, the signature, the ancient seal. He remembered his father's voice saying that some stories should stay buried. But Ivy had not forgotten. She didn't seek revenge. She just waited for him to look at himself. Ethan sank to the floor, the letter trembling between his fingers. This woman he had ridiculed in public was, in fact, the heir to a courage that his family should honor, and whom he had just insulted with the same arrogance that had nearly cost his grandfather his life. Shame burned inside him. The memory of the ridiculous knee in front of her was now unbearable, and for the first time, there was no one to blame but himself. After the discovery, Ethan tried to find her in every possible way, but it was as if Ivy had evaporated from the world. No phone number, no address, no sign. The event company she worked for hadn't seen her in weeks. He tried to contact other workers, colleagues, suppliers, but they all said the same thing. She had disappeared. And the more time passed, the more he felt her absence in ways he couldn't name. At first it was a restlessness. Then it turned into longing, and finally it turned into emptiness. A space inside him that could no longer be filled with parties, cars, or women. He tried to get back to his old routine, show up at dinners, smile in photos, make jokes. But it all sounded fake. His friends laughed as always, but he could see the barely concealed discomfort in their eyes. They knew about the embarrassment. They knew about the story. And now they no longer treated him with the same light. It seemed that by refusing the marriage proposal, Ivy had torn off a mask that everyone pretended not to see. He, who was the center of attention, was now being watched as if he were, carrying an exposed flaw. Days later, in a desperate attempt, he went to the neighborhood where he discovered she grew up. He walked through the potholed streets, went into a small grocery store that still held the old smell of a childhood badly lived. He asked about her. No one knew. A gray-haired man looked at him with a certain contempt and said only, "Boys like you always arrive late." These words accompanied him to the car. Ethan began to visit Caroline Holloway's grave. He didn't tell anyone. He went alone on Sunday mornings and stood looking at the simple tombstone with its already wilted flowers. One day, he found a note stuck between the stones. It had no recipient, but he knew it was for him. Forgotten promises come back like echoes, and sometimes to hear you have to be silent. He stayed there for hours. He tried to imagine what Ivy had gone through. He tried to understand her pain, her silence, her strength. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that she hadn't disappeared out of anger. She'd walked away so he could feel what it's like to search and not find, to want and not have, to love and not know if you'll be forgiven. For the first time, Ethan didn't want to win. He just wanted to see her again, to apologize without embellishments, to look into her eyes and say, "Now I see." But time went on, and all he had was the memory of her voice saying, "I'm not a gambling trophy." Words that echoed like a sentence and a lesson at the same time. It didn't take long for the outside world to start noticing the cracks that had previously been only visible to him. The restaurant episode, which had previously been the talk of the wealthy and discreet, finally broke through the walls of silence. Someone posted the video on a gossip page, and it took just one night for it to go viral. The comments were relentless. Millionaire humiliates waitress and gets historic response. She said no, and rightly so. He thought he owned the world, but she owned herself. Ethan watched in silence alone as his own downfall unfolded. The video, which he had never wanted to exist, was now on every feed, every morning newscast, every conversation. People he had never met spoke his name with contempt. Celebrities who had fawned over him avoided contact. Brands that had sponsored his businesses asked him to step aside. His stock plummeted. But it wasn't the money that hurt. It was the moral judgment, the dirty mirror that he was now forced to face in public. Questions began to come from all sides. Who was the girl? Why had he done it? Were there other victims? Why had he acted so arrogantly? He tried to issue a statement, to claim a misunderstanding, but it was no use. Because it wasn't just about a mistake. It was about everything he stood for. And Ivy, in his absence, became a symbol of a woman who doesn't bow down, of courage without shouting, of dignity that disarms even the most powerful. In a radio interview, an activist commented, "She didn't humiliate, she showed it, and that bothers more than any revenge." The court of public opinion had already decided. Ethan Bennett, once a symbol of success, was now seen as the portrait of a disconnected, empty elite, incapable of recognizing value outside of its own mirrors. Inside the company, the whispers grew louder. Directors began to flee. Investors walked away. And no matter how hard he tried to stop the damage, everything seemed to be falling. Apart in slow motion, one of his partners told him when they ended their partnership, "You didn't lose because of her. You lost yourself long before she showed up. She just turned on the light." Ethan started avoiding public places. He gave up events, red carpets, and dinners that used to make him feel great. And for the first time, he sat alone in a regular cafe where no one recognized him. Or if they did, they didn't care. It was as if the world had gone on, just without him at the center. Lissas, man who thought he controlled the narrative, was now just another supporting character, trying to figure out how everything had changed. And deep down, he knew. It wasn't her who had disappeared. It was him who was finally seeing himself. The following days were no longer counted by meetings, profits, or trips. They were counted by silences. Ethan began to wake up before sunrise, not because he had commitments, but because his sleep had become short, light, haunted by memories that gave him no respite. He began to walk around the city aimlessly. He sat on benches in squares where he had never noticed them before. He watched ordinary people coming and going, mothers with bags, men reading newspapers, workers with lunch boxes in their hands. For the first time, he saw what had always been there. He who had previously walked without looking anyone in the eye, now observed each face carefully. And the more I saw the world as it was, the more I felt ashamed of how I had treated it. He began to visit small bookstores, frequent simple cafes, and listen to random conversations. In one of these cafes, he heard a young woman talking about dignity as if it were a shield. He smiled, unnoticed. At first, I thought I needed to find her to have peace, but over time he understood that the peace he sought would not come from outside. He began to reorganize his own company. He cut back on lavish spending, on lavish events. He ended contracts with suppliers who exploited workers. He diverted millions of dollars in bonuses to educational scholarships. He created an internal program to support women who had been abused by the workplace. He didn't announce anything. He didn't give interviews. I wanted the changes to be real, not a magazine cover. He revisited his grandfather's letter to Caroline. He read it over and over and wrote a response. I wasn't sure it would make sense, but he did. He hand-delivered it to a community center in the neighborhood where Ivy grew up. He asked for it to be kept, even though she would never read it. The letter didn't apologize. It told, it confessed. It exposed the vanity, the arrogance, the emptiness, and it thanked him, simply, but truthfully. One rainy morning, Ethan returned to Caroline's grave. He brought fresh flowers. He sat on the wet ground and was silent for hours. And there, with his jacket soaked and his shoes sunk in the mud, he finally felt like a man without the polish, without the protection of his name, without the shield of money, just him and what was left. When he stood up, he felt something different. It wasn't lightness, it was responsibility. The certainty that what would come next wouldn't be to erase what he had done, but to honor what he could still do. He didn't know if she would come back. He didn't know if she would forgive him. But he knew he had to keep going. And that, in itself, made him a different person. It was on a random afternoon, when he was no longer looking for signs, that the reunion happened. Ethan had been invited, insistently, to speak at a small event on social entrepreneurship at a community college in Brooklyn. He almost turned it down. He still felt uncomfortable under the spotlight, even though he was now talking about transformation and not status. But he went, without a suit, without security, without a script, just with the idea of telling what he had experienced. He went up on stage in a modest auditorium with worn chairs and the smell of old wood, and told the truth, without embellishments, without apologies. He confessed the bet, he confessed the humiliation, he confessed the change. He said, "Someone I underestimated taught me that dignity is the greatest wealth someone can carry, and I only learned that when I lost." The silence that followed was absolute, and then shyly the audience applauded, not with euphoria, but with respect. At the end of the event, he stepped down from the stage and walked to the exit. Night had already fallen, and the wind carried dry leaves across the ground. That was when he saw her, standing on the other side of the sidewalk wearing a beige coat, her hair loose and the same firm gaze as before. Ivy. Time seemed to slow down. He stopped, his heart stuck in his throat. He didn't know if he should approach her. He didn't know if she was waiting for him there or if it was just a coincidence. But she took a step, then another, and so did he. They met in the middle of the street, between red lights and distant horns. She looked at him for a few seconds before saying anything. "You said it well back there." He took a deep breath. "I didn't deserve to be heard." She tilted her head slightly. "But it was still, because you were quiet enough to listen first." He wanted to say so many things, that he missed her, that he regretted it, that he had changed, that he thought about her every day. But he didn't say it. He just looked at her, and she understood. Ivy smiled. A small, restrained smile, but real. And in that moment he knew that the reunion was not a chance to go back to what was. It was a chance to be something new. They walked side by side until the end of the sidewalk. They didn't touch. They didn't talk about the past. They just shared silence. A different silence. One that held no weight. That held no blame. That simply existed. Like two paths that crossed again after long detours. He didn't ask where she had been. She didn't explain. Nothing there needed to be said. Because sometimes the deepest reunion is the one that doesn't require justifications. Just presence. They saw each other again the following week. No warnings, no promises. It was at a popular reading center where Ivy volunteered to teach literacy to immigrant women. He showed up at the door not to invade her space, but to see with his own eyes the woman who had taught him without raising her voice. She didn't seem surprised. She just smiled with her eyes, as if she understood that some visitors don't need to be announced. He sat in the back of the room and watched. For almost an hour he sat there in silence, watching how she spoke, how she listened, how she looked at each woman in front of her with respect. That was where she flourished. And on that stained cement floor, among plastic chairs and used books, he saw more nobility than at any gala event. At the end, she approached him. "I didn't expect you to come here," he answered quietly. "I didn't come for myself. I came for everything I hadn't seen before." They walked through the neighborhood without rushing, and then she told him where she had been. She said she had gone far away, to the countryside, to visit her own history, to find her mother's grave, to look back at her grandmother's letters, to reconnect with what really mattered. She hadn't run away from him. She had run away from what he represented. But now, looking at him, she saw another man. Not better, not worse, just naked, and that, in itself, was rare. They stopped in front of a closed store. Ivy took a folded piece of paper out of her pocket. It was a simple plan, a sketch of a project for a cultural center, with a library and space for free courses. That's what I want to build, a place where no one feels invisible. He looked at the paper reverently. What can I do for that? She answered without hesitation, help, but not with money, with silence, with respect, with presence. He nodded. I can do that. They stood there, for a few seconds amid the sound of cars and the light night breeze, until she said, I won't love you for who you were, nor for who you want to appear to be. I can only walk with you if, with each step, I continue to recognize myself. Ethan looked at the ground. That wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was an invitation, a warning, a limit. And he understood. Ivy didn't forgive with flowers, nor with sweet words. She forgave clearly, with a decision, to follow, and if he wanted to. Walk beside her, he would have to do the same. Not behind nor in front, beside, not out of pride, but by choice. Night fell completely, and they said goodbye with a look. A goodbye or a see you later. Neither of them said it, because now, words were no longer the most important part of the story. On a grey afternoon, the wind blew lightly over the damp sidewalks. Ethan walked alone through the streets of Brooklyn, without a suit, without haste. In his hands, he carried a brown envelope and a small clay pot, where a plant was still growing, still fragile but alive. When he reached the worn-out facade of an old abandoned warehouse, he stopped. He spent a few minutes observing the locked door, the broken windows, the silence around him. Then, delicately, he placed the envelope inside the rusty mailbox, and next to the threshold, positioned the pot. A folded paper emerged discreetly from the earth. It was the same plant that Ivy had shown him weeks before, now redrawn by hand by him, with new notes, suggestions, care. There was no sender, no signature, just a gesture. As he walked away, he looked back one last time. On the other side of the street, between shadows and the dim lights of the sunset, a female silhouette watched from afar. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled. Neither waved. But for a moment, time seemed to bend to that silence. She remained still, and he continued on his way. As he passed a group of children playing on the sidewalk, one of them fell. Ethan bent down without thinking, helped the boy up, cleaned his dirty knee and smiled a little. The child ran away laughing, not knowing who that man was. Ethan then looked at his own hands, still dirty with dirt. He took a deep breath and continued on. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story really touched you. So now it's up to you. Comment below. I'm not a betting trophy either, so I know you felt every scene with me. Leave a like so more people can get to know stories that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming. And click on the video that's appearing on the screen now, because the next story also starts with pain, but ends with something no one expected. I'll see you there.